Hey, good evening, everyone. So very good to be with you tonight, and continuing in our study as we've been discussing the devices of the devil to try to understand better the things that cause us to stumble, the way that our adversary sets up roadblocks in our life. He's been using the same plans we talked about last time over and over again, and we're going to spend a little time tonight talking about the idea of the changes in morality. Our class material is, of course, available on our website. I think we're only a couple of classes ahead of time. That's kind of how our class material producer works. He only gets a few in every couple of weeks, so sometimes it's a while before we get the final class material in there. But you can go to our website and you can pull up that information, and we've got questions on there that we'll be asking tonight. And that way you're ready ahead of time. I know it's a lot easier to answer a question if you've had a little time to think about it. So you can sort of go to our website, www.sunsetchurchofchrist.net. And as I said, you can check out our information there. Last week, if you remember what we talked about last week, we were in the Garden of Eden. And we were talking about how the serpent, who we're told in Revelation 20 is, of course, Satan, not a surprise, that the serpent had used certain ways to characterize the change, the way that he changed the morality of the moment. In other words, the way that he was able to change the concepts around what was right and wrong. And we said the first thing that he seemed to do was he tries to make this idea of what was evil seem less evil. He wants Eve to see the idea that violating God's will wasn't really that bad by lying. The very first thing he does is lie. He tells a lie. He says, surely you won't die. It's not that bad, in other words, he might want us to see. Secondly, he doesn't use the word sin. Instead, he talks about the idea that they would be wise. They would know right and wrong. Well, the point is there, he's twisting things around to get that idea of losing your innocence to be instead equated with becoming wise. Third, he tries to change the story as to who is in the right and who is in the wrong. Specifically, what he's trying to do is to make it appear that God simply doesn't want Eve or Adam to know what he knows. Finally, we added that one of the big things that Satan does is he then gets us to live with it. We talked briefly last time. In fact, our closing point was the question, is death a natural part of life? And we said originally it was not. It has become so. In fact, we're all very used to it today. But the point is, it's not as though death was part of God's plan from the beginning. So I want you to think about this plan for a moment. A few of you already kind of picked up where the direction we were going last time because you said, if you think about it, you see this plan in a lot of things today. And I want us to think about it like that. So let's consider this for just a few moments this evening. Let's make some applications of how this plan is still in use to change morality. So we'll start off by talking about the idea of promiscuity. You know what? Understand promiscuity, the idea of a sexual relationship outside of marriage. Specifically, we might talk about the idea of people that aren't married. That's changed a lot in society, right? In fact, in a lot of states, it used to be against the law to live together, a man and woman to live together if they weren't married. And in fact, I think it might still be the case in a couple of states, although it's not enforced. So let's say 1900, we wouldn't see two people dating being left alone until, but then by the 1980s and 90s, it was the thing. You talk about the idea of people that engaged in physical intimacy before marriage, sex before marriage, and how those numbers have changed in the last 40 years is dramatic. To the idea today that if you're a young adult and you cherish virginity or chastity, you're going to be mocked for that. You're going to be made fun of for that. Whereas 40 years ago, that would have been something that you would have been very proud to be known for being chaste and being virtuous. So how did Satan change that? Well, the first thing is Satan creates a morality or changes morality by giving us a lie that makes something seem less evil. So let me throw a couple of suggestions out there. And by the way, I'd love to hear what you think too. You might see some things that I don't see here, some of the steps here and how they're played out. But the very first thing I would say is that Satan's big lie about promiscuity is everyone is doing it. That's the big lie that he tells that the world believes today. Everyone is doing it. That promiscuity is common, and that it's the thing that, in fact, that if you're not participating in promiscuity, there might be something wrong with you. Well, that's the big lie. And that's the idea that Satan pursues and gets us to believe, that makes it seem like it can't be all that bad. Lots of really nice people have promiscuous lifestyles. Lots of, we turn on the TV and the good guy in the movie is promiscuous. And we start to believe that people who behave in a promiscuous lifestyle, they're not really bad people. Everybody's doing it is the lie. And that lie makes evil seem less evil. Well, the second way we might look at it, too, is that we then see that Satan starts to change the words around. Most people don't know the word fornication, right? If you throw that word out in the world today, people aren't going to know what you're talking about. In fact, I've many times had people reach out to me and say, the Bible doesn't say it's a sin to have a sexual relationship before marriage. And I'll say, well, what about the commands of fornication? They don't know what that means. So Satan has changed the words around. So instead of fornication, maybe people just talk about the idea of making love, and they try to soften that down to, living together, or, adult relationship or cohabitation. Those are all nice words that take away some of the characteristical the strength of words that speak to behavior that's immoral, behavior that's inappropriate. So by changing words, by calling things by other names, talking about promiscuity and talking about instead as, expressing love and things like that. One of the great dangers we have in our school system today is that many of our, I don't know how to say this with, certainly try not to be offensive, but there's a lot of people in the school system that promote the idea that if kids are going to be promiscuous, we ought to encourage them to do so responsibly. Again, that idea of, responsible reproductive behavior, somebody might say, or responsible behavior is certainly a part of that lie. So that reaches that case as well. Rob makes the statement, sin is sin. So is there a difference in fornication rather than adultery? The consequences can be very different, but it seems fornication is accepted more in society where adultery is not. Rob, great question. Let's just say this for a moment. Rob asked the question, is adultery and fornication the same thing? Fornication literally means, as it's translated from a word in Greek called porneos, illicit sexual intercourse. Sorry to be so graphic in that statement, but illicit sexual intercourse, meaning you're having a sexual relationship that is something that is forbidden by God. God blesses a sexual relationship within marriage. God desires that we should be sexual beings within marriage, but apart from the marriage of one man and one woman, God, which is Matthew 19 and how Jesus defines that, God lets us understand that when sexuality is taken out of that relationship, that it becomes sinful. Now, adultery speaks to the idea of violating the marriage covenant. Now, in places like Matthew chapter 5, Jesus told us that sometimes even just lusting can violate or create adultery because it's a type of betrayal of that covenant. Now, we want to be careful here. And I want you to listen carefully here. But the confusion comes up that sometimes people say, well, yeah, adultery is bad because that's what breaks the marriage covenant, according to Jesus in Matthew 19. No, actually, the Bible is explicit to say fornication. Go back and look in the Bible and you'll see it. Fornication is what breaks the marriage covenant, not just adultery. But fornication is a type of adultery. In other words, it is the type of adultery that does break the marriage covenant. But fornication is specifically in the Bible the idea of illicit or illegal sexual intercourse, and that's what breaks the marriage covenant. Not merely adultery, but adultery is the violation of the marriage, the promises made in marriage that includes fornication, but it also can be lust as well. I don't know if that was a very well phrased terminology or if I explained that very well, Rob. I hope that kind of got to the idea. Your second point, Rob, It is interesting that we live in a society that doesn't have a problem with fornication, but at least still has some problems with adultery. But let me say this, I think that that's changing too. I think more and more often our society accepts adultery as being simply the idea of finding the person you love. You see, our society has become one that esteems an emotional attachment that is what it calls love above everything else. I mean, what are most movies about? What are books about? What are TV shows about? But this idea of finding an emotional connection with someone else. And I think more and more often we're seeing in movies and TV and books and in just life around us that people tend to find it acceptable to leave one spouse to marry someone else because oftentimes they see that as pursuing a very fulfilling emotional relationship. The Bible does not teach that at all. But Rob, I would suggest that what you're pointing to there is an excellent example of Satan manipulating marriage and changing marriage. So that again, morality is changing. Adultery used to be evil. He makes it seem less evil by saying it's following your heart. He changes the way we think about things, and he sees people that would make us stay married to somebody else as evil. So the point is, Rob, absolutely, I would put some of the issues of adultery or divorce right up into this as well. Teresa says, even a lot of older adults practice promiscuity or have no objection to people living together outside of marriage, which is a terrible example for their children and grandchildren. Absolutely. Teresa, we're really in a time, probably the big change occurs in the 1960s and a movement in America that was called the free love movement, which was the idea that you could have an intimate relationship with anyone, whether you're married to them or not. And many of those people that were young people in the 1960s are the older adults of today. So you're absolutely right. This idea of living together before marriage has become the norm. In our society, that's more likely to occur than people remaining chaste until they're married. It wasn't always that way. That's really a remarkable thing. Even for my generation, it had changed by the time we got to my generation, that more often than not, people lived together before they were married. And believe it or not, there are a lot of people that believe that living together before marriage is actually wise. I mean, it's completely contrary to the Bible. And honestly, actually, it's completely contrary to most studies that have been done to see whether or not a marriage is more likely to succeed if somebody lives together first. It's simply not the case. So the point is, ironically, there's a societally accepted idea that, you live together before you're married is a good thing, and it's absolutely not. Neither from God's standard, which is the only standard that matters, but even studies can reveal that that's not the case as well. Lamar's got a comment here. He says, Satan uses fear and our focus on what we can and cannot control to shift us away from complete faith in God. 1 John 14 and verse 18, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. See, that's important to understand. It's a great comment, Lamar. That's important to see that Satan wants us, in part, to have a fear. And what I'm going to suggest, and I don't know, Lamar, maybe this is what you're kind of pointing to or not, but one of the things that Satan really does is he wants us to fear the norms of society. That, in other words, if you can change what's right and wrong, he wants us to be afraid to stand up and be different. So I think that there's something really significant about this that would fit to that as well. Today, as I said, the point with promiscuity is most of us are prepared to live with it. We'll watch it on TV. We'll watch it in movies because we just have accepted that it is the norm. And that's one of Satan's great goals. Let's consider another one, if you would, for just a second. How about homosexuality? And I see Rob's going to that direction as well. Rob's statement is, so one man, one woman in marriage, as in the Bible. What is a homosexual relationship besides either of those in a so-called marriage? Satan manipulates the straightforward word to confuse us all. So, Rob, well, I won't ask you because maybe you won't have time to answer, but my question would be, Satan begins this change by giving us a big lie. What do you think the big lie or the big lies of homosexuality are? What are the big lies of homosexuality? This is maybe you can pick this up pretty quickly. I think that the lies of homosexuality are ones that we're probably pretty familiar with. In a second, I'm going to say what are the words that they've changed and done and created to change the way we think, and how is it that they've changed the sense of who the adversary is. Tell me this: what is it about homosexuality that begins with a big lie, a lie that absolutely changes the way we think? Teresa's got it. Very good, Teresa. The biggest lie of homosexuality is that we are born this way. That, in other words, there's something natural about homosexuality. Now, you know that in Romans chapter 1, Stan's got it too. A person is made this way. Very good, Stan. That in Romans chapter 1, the Bible says that the natural desire of a man is for a woman, the natural desire of a woman is for a man, and that when people give up their natural desires, the Bible goes on to describe the homosexuality lifestyle that erupts from this. Well, the point is, homosexuality, the way that idea has been changed 50 years ago, it was even against the law. It was certainly something that was socially unacceptable. Even, in my childhood and as a young adult, it was still socially looked down upon to some degree. So one of the biggest lies about homosexuality, the big one is you're born this way, that it's natural. It's funny that there's not any kind of study or any kind of, whenever they plotted the human genome, they didn't find anything that made the case that there was a natural component of homosexuality. And yet people argue that all the time. They'll try to make all sorts of nonsensical cases to try to demonstrate that homosexuality is normal, that it's a way that people are born, and that to be opposed to it is just as much to be opposed to somebody because of the color of their skin or something else that they're born with, that there's nothing we can control about homosexuality. I see Aline says, even watching the news desensitizes us to fornication and homosexuality. And she picks on the third point, by the way. She says, we're the bigots. That's a remarkable idea of how Satan changes the way people look at things. As far as, let me jump back for just a second because I don't know if I mentioned it. As far as with the idea of promiscuity, which is again to say, intimate relations before you're married, what it's done is it uses terms like you're a Puritan or, you're just old-fashioned. Those are bad, but it becomes worse with something like homosexuality, where the adversary becomes somebody who says, hey, this is wrong. This isn't God's will. That person becomes a bigot is an important point to consider. Debbie brings up another one, by the way, I think is good. Debbie says, Jesus didn't teach against it. That's interesting, by the way, because we actually just recently had an article that talked about the idea that the entirety of the New Testament is the word of Christ. That the apostles were speaking for Jesus when they told us things about, for example, homosexuality or other things that Jesus may not have had much to discuss. So that certainly is a lie that's brought up about homosexuality. Jesus wasn't against it. Is a good one. Fundamentally, though, people are going to throw out the idea primarily that homosexuality is something that you're born with. It's a lie. It's just a flat out lie. There was never a basis for that lie. It was simply created to say, hey, I can't help it. Well, that point of I can't help it is important. It's victimization. We talk about oftentimes how often in the Bible people try to claim that they're merely a victim of their circumstances and they have no control over something. So many people might say, well, I don't have any control over this because I was born this way, and yet that's a lie. Word change, the word play. What are the words that get used? Homosexuality is kind of a harsh word. So what's the word that changed in the 20th century to refer to homosexuality that took some of the sexual indication out of the language, you might say? What is the word that gets used and gets transformed, from one meaning to another so that it changes the way we think about things? And I know you're about to type the answer in, but I'm going to give it away anyway. How about the word gay? That used to mean happy. That used to mean joyful. it was a genius maneuver to take that term and begin to apply it to those who are homosexual. It was genius in a diabolical way, to be sure. But the idea, and Teresa got it, I appreciate that. But the idea is, being gay, you think happy, becomes the idea that homosexuals are happy, or that you could be happy being homosexual. Let me jump back, by the way. Teresa's got a good comment about the great lie. She says there's a commercial that says, when you were randomly assigned male or female at birth. By the way, that's that gender conversation about what we call, well, what the world calls transgender. Transgender is oftentimes usually a variation on homosexuality, and it fits the same lies, by the way. It fits the same lies to say, first and foremost, you're born this way. And again, the changing of words. So those things make that case as well. Debbie throws out there the term same-sex relationship. That makes it softer. By the way, here's another word play. If you were against homosexuality, if you took the stand that Jesus does, that his apostles do, that you stand where, Mary would have stood, or, Priscilla or Aquila, any of those New Testament Christians, the word that's used today to describe you is homophobic. There's a car as I drive down Baseline, and they have a term, don't be transphobic. So again, these words are being used in both of these movements today. But why is homophobic such a powerful thing? Because it implies that if you're against these things, it's not just that you're against it, it's that there's something wrong with you, right? It isn't just that you say, hey, I don't think this is right. It's that you have some problem, some way of thinking that itself is demented. That's a fascinating way that Satan gets people to change the way they think, by using words that convey that idea. So when you create a word that makes it suddenly seem like it's evil to do the right thing, hey, it's lots of times that's the case, right? Lots of times where people create a word, legalist is one of the ones I often point to, that people talk about the idea, well, you're a legalist. And, well, what is legalist? I mean, if the idea is I believe in being lawful before God, a lot of legalists in the Bible. What is homophobic? It literally means I'm afraid of homo means the same, so I'm afraid of the things that are the same. I mean, there's absolutely no logic to it. But it's a fantastic manipulation of society, because whatever it is, I don't want to be it. That's certainly how people look at it. So suddenly, by changing words, by getting words to have different meanings, you change who the adversary is. It's no longer, the person who has the deviant lifestyle. It's now people that say it's wrong. They're the bad guys in this story. Aline said a moment ago, they're the bigots. They're the ones that are full of hate, and boy, that term hate really gets manipulated and used a lot. They're full of hate and prejudice. And the point is that oftentimes that's how the world would view somebody who stands exactly as Jesus stood 2,000 years ago. What Jesus said about marriage in Matthew 19 left no room for a homosexual relationship. But if we say that today, that is a message of hate. Jesus, who gave the greatest act of love in the history of humanity, by modern definition, is full of hate because of the things that he taught and he said. Teresa says the world doesn't understand, or want to understand, that by disapproving of a practice, you're not hating people or a person. Teresa, that's right. But guess what, Teresa? Again, we're not dealing necessarily just with the mass of people who aren't thinking about it. We're actually dealing with an adversary who in some way manipulates minds, not just to see, that we don't agree that it's dangerous, but manipulates minds to turn on us, those who would want them to be saved, to be healed. Sherry goes on to talk about this. The word changed that a drunkard now has a disease. Teresa, or Sherry, I actually want to come to that. Actually, you know what, Sherry? I pulled it out of my slides. I had alcohol use and the acceptance of alcohol in our society as one of the things to consider to make evil seem less evil. Another one of those everybody does it lies. You know what's funny about alcohol? You know, we just live in a world where it's presumed everybody does it, and they don't. You know, Daria was talking about being out camping recently, and one of the other campers brought over a bottle of wine and just presumed everybody would want to share it. And a lot of people believe that. They believe the lie that everybody does it. Wordplay. You're exactly right, Sherry. You're picking up on Satan's plan. The wordplay is that drunkards aren't drunkards. They're people that have a disease. You know that that it's not their fault. Again, there's that concept of changing the way we look at things. And ultimately, people that want to control alcohol, the abolitionists, if you would, they're the real bad guys in these stories. So that really is a great point to consider. You know, ultimately, Satan's goal is always, after changing the adversary, after making those who are righteous look like the bad guy, Satan's goal is to get us to live with it. And we do. I mean, it's, like I said, it's at a point where, you know, if we see it in, you know, workplace movies and things like that, we don't bat an eye anymore because it's become so commonplace. And that's a powerful part of this plan, just to make us live with it. And oftentimes we're willing to say, hey, if at least there's some restriction, you know, I could live with that. So the point is, we see perfectly in how homosexuality has changed in our society in the last 50 years. We see perfectly how this has played out. Here's another one to consider for a moment. How about abortion? How could you make the evil of abortion seem less evil? How could you change somebody to make them consider the idea that to abort a child, an unborn child, isn't as evil a thing as it seems? How would you soften that with a lie? What would that lie be like to soften the idea of abortion? What would you say makes the idea of abortion seem less evil? You know, for one thing, you'll always notice that you know, people who support abortion and want abortion to be something that prevails in our society, they don't call themselves pro-abortion, right? They use other things and other terms. What is it that they say or they talk about? What is the lie that they bring about? Debbie brings about the "my body, my choice" language, and by the way, that does sound less evil. That's a great way of putting it. Teresa says this, and this is kind of what I was leaning to first. It's not a baby. It's fetus or just a clump of cells. Now just think about this for a second. If it's not a baby, if it's not a human being in there, then it's like removing my kidney or removing an organ of some kind. It's just something that I can take off, but it's actually not a person. So one of the first things we can do is we can change the way it is spoken of, that, you know, we don't talk about the idea of aborting a baby. We talk about aborting a fetus. That kind of fits in the wordplay too, by the way. It figures this. Aline says product of pregnancy. Again, a product of pregnancy, fetus. All of these are terms that make a child not really a child. Not really a child. So these are exactly right ideas. Now, one of the things what we kind of delve into here when we say here's this lie that makes it seem less evil is, well, like I said, if we're not aborting a child, but instead we're removing tissue, one of those sounds terrible, and one of those doesn't sound bad at all, right? Well, that's it. You lie. You say it's not a human being. Everything in the Bible says it's human. By the way, everything outside of the Bible says it's human too. There's no case to be made that an unborn child is not a human being. I mean, there's no case to be made. What case can you make? Could you say, well, you're not human because you're not full of competent thought? You know, we're probably not full of competent thought till we're in our 20s. We're not human because of our size. I'm bigger than most people. Does that make me more human than most people? Almost any way you can approach the idea of contrasting whether or not somebody in a person in the womb is human or not, they're nonsensical if you try to apply them, especially with the idea that you could take a baby a month old and a baby a month from being born and they're virtually going to be identical. And our society says one of those is a human being and one of those is not. It's silly. It's a silly logic, but the logic is necessary to change the way we think. And Teresa throws out there, with most people, the things we're discussing, the world would say, well, it's not going to hurt anyone. Well, Teresa, I would suggest to you that what the world might say is that we're actually hurting people not to allow abortion. Let's go to the second one, though, the word play. A couple of you already picked that up. My body, my choice. My body, my choice, pro-choice, is a great way of saying I'm pro-abortion. But what it is it doesn't sound bad. You've changed the conversation by changing the words. When somebody says I'm pro-choice, they mean they're pro-abortion. But by saying it that way, it suddenly makes it sound like, but I'm not. It takes away a great deal of the onerous of the heinous nature of that circumstance. Again, it's this idea of, by changing words, you change the way people think. So you change words and you change the way people see things to be true or not true. So it's marvelous to say I'm pro-choice, and instead of abortion, it's a reproductive right. I saw somebody had something else. Oh, Debbie has birth control alternative, another great term that switches things around. And here's an interesting thing. And by the way, Lamar really gets this to point number 3 too. He says, talking about the mother's ethical care and her choices versus protecting the unborn child. Now, this is where it's important. And Lamar's really making a great transition for us, because if you can successfully change the narrative from a conversation about a baby to a conversation about the mother, and by the way, don't use the word mother. The late Supreme Court Justice Ginsburg, she was really offended because in a debate, somebody talked in a debate that brought up abortion. The person had talked about, one of the other justices had said something about the mother, and Ginsburg got real mad. Don't call her a mother, Well, yeah, you wouldn't want to use that term if you're pro-choice, and she certainly was pro-abortion. Well, the point is, you want to focus in on the woman and say, here's this woman. The story that's used most often is she's a very young teenager. She's the victim of rape or some other thing like that. And by the way, most abortions aren't. That's not the circumstance that they are. But it's portrayed that way, and it becomes a story where it's an oppression of women. In fact, one of the key words in the last decade or two that's really gotten a lot of traction is that people have taken the term war on women and applied it to the idea of being against abortion. If you're against abortion, they say, you are against women. I just saw somebody today who had something on the internet, and it said, I'm pro-woman and I'm pro-choice, And the idea was that if you don't believe in abortion, you are against women. I've seen some outrageous statements like that made, but guess what? Lots of people make them because lots of people believe them. Sometimes it's just amazing. And I always feel like abortion is probably one of the most astoundingly ignorant debates that people go into today as far as moral, immoral. I think it's the easiest one to make the case that it's immoral. But the irony is, once people buy it into that false language, once people can change that adversary around, you can have a huge portion of the population that can be right behind this terrible idea. And they're right behind it because this plan works. This plan of how you change people's minds works. It's interesting. Cindy Wade uses that word feminist, kind of interesting. Cindy, feminist is kind of falling out of favor, it seems like, a little bit, because I think it gets it's properly so, gets a negative connotation to it. But certainly on the other hand, it really does get thrown around in these conversations a lot as well. And finally, get them to live with it. All the stink right now is about this law in Texas. The law in Texas on abortion. I noticed that our governor has had our attorney general file a lawsuit against it. I wrote off a letter to one of our congresswomen about it, saying, why on earth is our state going into this? Why on earth is our state, even having a say-so on this? But it's not to stop abortion. It just says, let's make it only legal for the first part of a pregnancy. It's still murder. It's still awful. And yet, ironically, we kind of feel like, well, we've got to win there because Satan has successfully got us to feel like we just have to live with it. That it's just the way that it is. And again, it's a fantastic part of his plan. Every political cycle there is, I don't think about the idea that maybe we'll turn, a decision that makes abortion legal around. I don't even think that way because I just don't even believe it's possible. Because Satan has successfully gotten us to live for it. Here's a great statement. Teresa says, if you can convince women to abort their babies, that pretty much sears their conscience for all other sin as well. Teresa, there's something profoundly important about this idea that you're pointing to, and let's kind of maybe camp on it a moment. If a woman has had an abortion, she most of the time has done so based on believing the first lie, the lie that you're not really taking the life of a child. And it is the case that sometimes women realize what they've done, and they have a horrible sense of guilt. Well, I tell you what, every time I try to remind people, well, that's what Christ is about. We're all guilty of sin. And of course, his mercy is to take away that sin. But the other point that I want to say is that that as long as we understand, like I said, and accept the idea that we've been deceived by a lie, we understand that that's how Satan has always worked. Now, on the other side of that, I think that there are people who, having practiced that, they can never admit what they did because of the nature of admitting that they took somebody's life, that they committed a murder, if you would, in that practice. And I'm careful to say that. Like I said, it's a murder by deception, if nothing else, that we might call it. But still, the point is, I think for a lot of people, their conscience can't accept that. I hear especially of people that have really pushed this, pushed abortion in our society. And I often think, I think they would be like the Apostle Paul, that if they came to the knowledge of the truth, that it would overwhelm them with the nature of the conduct that they had done. So, Teresa, I think your comment's really good, and it reminds us, first of all, to be merciful to people who, participated in abortion, because almost all of them were lied to from the beginning. I really don't think there's almost anyone who wasn't lied to in order to, to be brought into this conduct. And a lot of times people, they can almost not bear to get out of it because of what it means they have to admit. Stan makes a comment here. Good one. Stan says abortion can desensitize people in regards to other killing of people, murder, etc. Stan, that's a great point. In fact, a lot of times we kind of suggest that a society that has no care for unborn life soon loses its care for a great deal of life. A society that puts children to death is a society that puts its older members to death, euthanizes them. Here in Oregon, we have some of the most outrageous abortion laws in the country, that a person can be put to death right up to the moment they're born. We also are the place where, we have assisted suicide. Those things aren't a coincidence. I think that there is absolutely a disregard for life that grows. How long is it going to be till we say if somebody is mentally ill, they should be put to death? Or, somebody has a view that's contrary to society, somebody's homophobic or, is against women's choice, should be put to death. And as outrageous as that might sound, it's really not that outrageous that people might end up thinking that way, because once we start on a pattern where we say life by my definition, if I get to define what living and not living is, or what human and not human is, all it takes is somebody just to have a new variation on what that definition means. And we've seen it in the past where lots of societies throughout history have wiped out other groups. We sometimes use the word genocide to describe it. But the point is, it's wiping out other people because we've made a determination that they're not people. It really is outrageous. I spent a lot of time on this, and like I said, in fact, I spent most of our time on this. I didn't appreciate that, but I really just wanted us to get a sense of how it is that this permeates our culture. Drug use. We can say that drug use fits this nicely by making it seem less bad than it is. You hear all the time people say, well, marijuana is not addictive, and, marijuana actually has a lot of good characteristics. There's a lot of lies about marijuana. You change the words around, you change it to medicinal or things like that make it sound less bad. If, somebody says, I have a, medicinal marijuana, that doesn't sound nearly as bad. You've changed the words. You change the adversary. You begin to make people that say this is wrong look like the bad guys. This is a fantastic plan. Satan has used it all throughout history to get people to do things that they wouldn't have done normally, that they see things and they accept things personally or as a society, and they can change things around. And we're amazed every time to say, wow, how come people change this much? But it's our adversary's plan. This plan is effective, it works, and it changes the way people see things and the way people perceive things. I'll tell you what, let's go ahead and rather than pick up in our next class, let's go ahead and stop just a few minutes early. You guys are always patient with me whenever we stop quite a bit late. So we'll stop just a couple of minutes before our time here. Just understand that we can take this and we can apply it to so many societal problems today. The idea that with a lie, you make something seem less bad, that by changing words and their meanings, you can make people think differently. By changing the idea of who the bad guy is in the concepts of righteousness, you get the whole of society to switch sides. And then finally getting us to live with it makes us less likely to push back. And as I said, it's a fantastic plan that Satan concocted. He's been using it from the beginning, and he's going to keep using it in our lives as well. Well, thanks so much. We had a lot of great comments and thoughts this evening, and I appreciate all of them. And certainly, as we prepare ourselves next week, we'll be picking up as we talk about Jesus. What happens when Jesus is confronted with this plan? When Satan tries to manipulate Jesus in Luke chapter 4, how does Jesus resist? How does Jesus resist in a way his ancestor Eve, and it's kind of a neat thing to think about, Eve being an ancestor of Jesus, as Jesus was in the flesh. How is it that Jesus succeeded where Eve failed? So that'll be our point. Next week, we'll pick up there. That's lesson number 3. You can get that material off of our website. Thanks again so much for some fantastic questions and comments. God bless you guys in this new week.